I didn't shout. I didn't explain. I just left a note above the coffee maker and walked away. Gone to the ocean. The people who care about me know where to find me. After years of being treated like a burden, I stopped asking for a seat at their table. I chose silence, not surrender. What came next? His panic, the neighbor's whispers, the truth he never expected, isn't the beginning. The real story starts when I stopped waiting to be invited and decided to go where I was truly welcome. The silver fork trembled slightly in my hand as I set it down beside the untouched salmon. I hadn't taken a single bite. My appetite had vanished the moment the conversation shifted the way it always did when Victoria started comparing families. The dining room was quiet now, the clinking of cutlery replaced by a heavy pause and the slow metronome tick of the antique wall clock. Victoria's voice had just filled the room with practiced sweetness. "Mom just got back from the lake house," she beamed. "And next weekend we're meeting her at the beach property. You know, to help her decide on new flooring. Then there's the mountain cabin for winter holidays. She's thinking of expanding the deck." Michael nodded proud as if it were his own mother with the real estate portfolio. His eyes slid toward me. "And you, Mom, still in that cramped little studio?" He said it like a joke. Light, casual. But his tone carried an undercurrent I knew too well. Dismissive. Superior. He wasn't asking. He was commenting. Judging. I looked at him across the table. At 42, Michael had his father's broad frame, but none of his warmth. He was dressed in that navy sports coat. He loved, the one that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Victoria sipped her wine delicately, her mouth curled into what might have passed for a smile if not for the unmistakable flicker of triumph in her eyes. Grace, my granddaughter, sat between them, quiet. She was older now, early 20s. But in that moment she looked just like she did when she was 10, and unsure how to respond when adults turned sharp. She didn't say anything. No one did. I wanted to disappear into the chair, shrink into the floor. But instead I sat up straighter. My back ached from the effort. My knees reminded me that I wasn't built for graceful exits anymore. But my voice held. "I moved out of that apartment a while ago," I said calmly, the words falling from my mouth, before I fully realized I was saying them. "I live in a house by the ocean now. Beautiful view. Peaceful. But only the people who care about me knew." There was a beat of silence, sharp and brittle. Even the ticking clock seemed to falter. Michael blinked. Victoria's hand tightened around her wine glass. Grace turned to me slowly. Confusion furrowing her brow. "You what?" Michael asked, his voice forced light. "You live by the ocean." I nodded, my hands folded gently in my lap. "Yes, I've been there for some time now." It wasn't just a lie. It was a wish. A longing I had buried under years of rent receipts and dollar store tea. A dream I hadn't dared whisper aloud even to myself. But when he sneered at my life, at my effort to survive with dignity, I felt something inside me snap into place, something protective, defiant. No one knew what to say. Not even Victoria, and she always had something. I pushed my chair back. It scraped against the tile, loud and final. I stood slowly, steadying myself with the back of the chair, my purse already hanging from the armrest. I looked around the table once more. "This was lovely," I said, and I almost meant it. "Thank you for dinner." I turned and walked toward the front hall. The family photo from last Christmas hung on the wall by the door. Matching outfits forced smiles. I wasn't in it. I had spent that Christmas alone in my studio apartment eating a frozen turkey meal and watching black and white movies. No invitation had come. No explanation either. "The house where I live," I said over my shoulder, "it's where the people who love me come to visit." And then I walked out. The night air hit me like a blessing, sharp and clean. I felt their silence behind me. Chairs shifting, murmurs, rising, a hint of panic maybe. I didn't look back. The car I drove, a used Honda Civic with a rattling engine, sat waiting in the driveway between their new model SUV and Victoria's luxury sedan. My purse felt heavy on my shoulder, not because of its contents, but because of what I was carrying. Hurt pride, something raw and long buried, now rising to the surface. As I pulled away, the warmth of their front porch light faded behind me. I counted the minutes to my studio. 23. I'd driven it enough times to know. 23 minutes between their world and mine. 23 minutes between abundance and just getting by. Between holiday meals and leftover soup. My building, Sunset Manor, stood dim and unassuming at the edge of downtown. Beige siding. An elevator that groaned with every floor. My Unit 3B smelled faintly of stale pot roast and lemon cleaner. I turned the key and stepped inside. 400 square feet. A Murphy bed. A tiny kitchen. A bathroom with tiles from the 70s. My home. My cage. My survival box. But tonight something had shifted. I kicked off my shoes, dropped my keys into the chipped bowl by the door, and walked into the kitchen. The kettle took longer to boil than I liked. I reached for my mother's old ceramic mug, the one with the faded roses, and prepared my nightly tea. As the water steeped, I felt the lie echo in my chest, not with shame, but with something else. Possibility. A house by the ocean. I sat in my recliner, pulled the thrifted blanket over my legs, and closed my eyes. He had humiliated me, publicly, painlessly in his view. In his world it was just banter, just a comment over dinner. But to me it was a dismissal of everything I'd endured. The rent payments, the late-night shifts, the years of doing without so Michael could have piano lessons, summer camp, braces. And now I was a footnote to his perfect life, the woman who raised him in silence so he could learn to speak loudly. My phone buzzed. A text from Michael. Sorry if that came out wrong. What house are you talking about? I stared at the message, then pressed delete. Another followed. We need to talk. This isn't like you. I almost laughed. This isn't like me. He hadn't asked me about my life in years. Didn't know what was like me anymore. That lie I told at dinner? It was the first thing I'd said in a long time that felt right. I closed my eyes and imagined it. The ocean, the sound of waves, the salty air. If I had such a house, would they come? Would they still try to fix me, manage me, pat me on the head like a confused old woman? Or would they be the ones with questions, with doubts, with growing fear that I might have a life that no longer revolves around them? I sipped my tea, the warmth grounding me. Michael had made his choice. So had I. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like explaining. The door clicked shut behind me, and for a moment I just stood there staring into the familiar dimness of my apartment. Studio 3B. The same beige walls, the same creaky floorboards, the same small table with one chair because no one ever came to visit. It was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of a siren far off downtown. I took off my coat and hung it on the rack that wobbled if you touched it too hard. The kettle still sat where I'd left it earlier, and the half-burned lavender candle on the counter had long since stopped giving off any real scent. I walked over to the Murphy bed, still folded up into the wall, and pulled it down with a sigh. The sheets were clean. Always clean. I made sure of that. Some habits stuck even when no one saw. 5 years in this space. 5 years since Robert passed. 5 years since the lawyers had picked through our life, labeled things with numbers, and handed me a checklist of what I could keep. I'd held on to his wedding band for a while, wore it on a chain around my neck like a secret. But when the car broke down and the rent was due, I'd sold it. It wasn't sentiment that paid bills. It was survival. I sat at the edge of the bed and stared out the single window that looked over the parking lot. The same flickering streetlight blinked like a tired eye. A group of college kids were gathered near the dumpster, smoking, laughing. I didn't know their names. They didn't know mine. But every so often, if one of them locked themselves out, they'd knock on my door to borrow a phone. I never minded. I used to imagine something more. A guest room, a garden, maybe a porch swing. Robert and I had talked about it once back when we were both still working. still planning for a retirement we never got to share. He loved the ocean, always said the sound of waves was better than any sleeping pill. We dreamed of a small house near the coast, something quiet, simple. I used to joke that he was a seagull in a past life, the way he could sit for hours just watching the tide. After he died, I thought maybe I'd go anyway, fulfill the dream for both of us. But then Michael lost his job for a while and Grace was applying to colleges, and there was always some reason to stay. Always something to pay for. I'd convinced myself I was being practical. That this little box of a studio was enough. That being close to family mattered more than ocean breezes or sunrises over water. But now, after what happened at dinner, I wasn't so sure anymore. The phone buzzed on the nightstand, a message from Michael. "Hey, just checking in. About earlier, didn't mean to upset you." Another followed from Victoria. "Hope you got home safe. That thing you said about the ocean house just confused us a little. Let's talk soon." They kept coming. More messages, more attempts to smooth things over. Not because they were truly sorry, but because they were uncomfortable. My discomfort had interrupted their curated lives, and now they needed to fix it, to box me up again into something manageable. Not one message asked me if I was okay. Not one said, "How are you really doing, Mom?" I didn't answer. Instead, I made a cup of tea and curled up in my recliner with the blanket Robert used to throw over his lap. It still smelled faintly of the cedar chest I'd kept it in all those years. I looked around my space. Every piece of furniture had a story, but none of them were part of a future. Just remnants of a life I was trying to preserve even as it crumbled around me. My birthday had come and gone last month. No cake, no card. I'd bought myself a soft cotton nightgown and wrapped it just to feel something close to celebration. Christmas, the year before, Michael had sent a generic gift card and a group text. Grace hadn't called. Victoria had posted photos online of their tree, their matching pajamas, their 3-story home bathed in warm light. I hadn't even been invited. I'd told myself it didn't matter, that I was older now, that these things were for children. But the truth was, I still wanted to be remembered, to be wanted. I sipped my tea and turned on my laptop, the old refurbished one I bought after months of putting away $20 bills in a jar behind the sugar canister. The screen lit up slowly, flickering once before it settled. I opened a browser and stared at the blank search bar. Then, without really thinking, I typed oceanfront cottages for rent. Instantly, images appeared. Homes perched on cliffs, wraparound porches, white shutters, rooms with windows that opened onto waves. One even had a fireplace just like the one Robert always wanted. Most were far beyond what I could afford. But still I scrolled. The photos weren't just pictures. They were reminders that something else was possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. I opened another tab. Coastal towns with art communities. Then another. Cheap ocean rentals with utilities. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe I wasn't even looking. Maybe I was just letting myself imagine again, after years of being told that dreams were childish, impractical, indulgent. The tea had gone cold by the time I closed the laptop. I stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down one of Robert's old journals. He used to scribble notes about places he wanted to visit, sketch little maps of Maine and the Carolinas. I opened it to a page where he'd written, "Retirement plan, find the sea, find peace." I traced the words with my finger. He hadn't gotten the chance. But maybe I still could. I walked back to the bed and pulled the blanket up over my knees. The idea of leaving this place, of starting over at my age, was terrifying. I had just enough to scrape by. Any misstep would mean trouble. But then again, wasn't I already in trouble? Wasn't being invisible its own kind of slow unraveling? My phone buzzed again. Another message from Michael. I didn't even look. Instead, I turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the refrigerator hum and the neighbor's footsteps above. But I wasn't really in the room anymore. I was somewhere else. Somewhere with sea air and salt on the wind. Somewhere I could breathe. Somewhere I could become myself again. The morning after I searched for oceanfront cottages, I found myself wide awake before dawn, my mind buzzing in a way it hadn't in years. The apartment was still dark, but the streetlight outside cast a pale glow on the carpet. I didn't bother making tea. I just dressed quietly, pulled on my warmest sweater, and slipped out before the building fully stirred to life. The harbor was only a 20-minute drive, but I hadn't been there in ages. Not since Robert passed, not since I'd allowed myself to want things. The streets were still damp from last night's drizzle, the air sharp with salt and wood smoke. I parked near the docks where fishing boats bobbed gently in the early morning light. The water stretched out endlessly before me, a calm silver under the pale sky. It was beautiful in that rugged, breathless kind of way. And standing there with nothing but the wind and the gulls, I felt something loosen in my chest. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't surrounded by reminders of what I didn't have. I wandered down to the edge of the boardwalk, hands deep in my coat pockets, watching as a few fishermen hauled gear onto their boats. Across the harbor, buildings sat clustered together like old friends. Weathered, worn, but sturdy. That's how I felt lately. Weathered, worn, still here. I wasn't paying attention when a woman stepped up beside me. Her voice startled me gently. "Beautiful morning for it." I turned. She looked to be around my age, maybe a little younger. Her silver hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. She wore paint-streaked jeans, thick boots, and a fisherman's sweater that had clearly seen many seasons. "Yes," I said. "It is." She extended a hand without hesitation. "Claire Monroe. I've got a little art studio a few blocks over. Come down here when I need to remember why I paint seascapes." "Amelia Hayes," I replied, surprised by the strength of her grip. "I haven't been here in years." "Well, welcome back," she said with a warm, matter-of-fact tone. "You look like you're thinking through something." I hesitated, but there was something about Claire, solid, unfiltered, that made it easy to speak. "I told a lie yesterday. I admitted my voice barely above the wind. A big one. Good for you," she replied without missing a beat. "About time." I blinked. "You don't even know what I lied about." "Doesn't matter," she said. "The way you said it told me everything I need to know. Someone made you feel small and you decided to take up space. That's something I respect." I smiled despite myself. "I told my son I live in a house by the ocean." Claire raised an eyebrow. "And do you?" "No. I live in a studio apartment downtown, 398 square feet, one window that faces a parking lot and a stove with 2 working burners." She didn't laugh. She didn't make a face. She just nodded. "I've been living in the same house for 30 years, she said after a moment. "Bought it when my husband passed. Needed to start over somewhere quiet. It's nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a roof that leaks if you don't keep an eye on it. But I wake up every morning to the sound of the waves. That sounds like heaven." "It is," she said. "It's also lonely sometimes. Been thinking about getting a roommate." I looked at her, not sure if I'd heard right. A roommate, someone quiet, someone who doesn't mind salt air and peeling paint, someone who understands that silence is golden but conversation is silver. Know anyone like that? I laughed softly, unsure if she was serious. "I don't know if I could afford a place like that." Claire shrugged. "I'm not looking to make money. Just cover utilities, help with groceries. $400 a month, give or take. You get your own room. It faces the harbor. $400. It was more than my current rent, but not by much." And the idea of waking up to the ocean, of watching the tide instead of tail lights, it was almost too much to hope for. "Why are you offering this to a stranger?" I asked, still skeptical. Claire looked out at the water. "Because 30 years ago I was a stranger in this town with a broken heart and a suitcase full of regret. Someone helped me then. Maybe it's time I pass it forward." She reached into her coat and pulled out a simple white business card. It had her name and a phone number. No website, no fancy title. just Claire Monroe printed in neat letters. "Think about it," she said, pressing the card into my palm. "If you're interested, call me. I'll show you the place." And with that, she walked off her boots, thudding softly against the boardwalk, leaving behind the scent of paint and wind and something I couldn't quite name. I sat on the bench where we'd stood together and stared at the card in my hand. The edges were slightly bent and there was a blue paint smudge in one corner. It was real. She was real. The offer, impossible as it seemed, was real. Could I do it? The thought filled me with equal parts excitement and fear. I hadn't made a big decision for myself in years. Every move I'd made since Robert died had been about staying afloat, staying near Michael, staying invisible. What would happen if I stopped staying and started choosing? My phone buzzed. A message from Victoria this time. "Michael and I think we should sit down and talk. You've been acting unlike yourself." I didn't answer. I didn't even open it. I slipped the phone back into my coat and watched the gulls wheel overhead, their cries sharp and joyful. The card was still in my hand, and for the first time in a long time I felt like maybe, just maybe, I had somewhere to go. I didn't call Claire right away. I drove home first, back to the studio, back to the kettle and the chipped mug, and the room that held so many quiet compromises. I looked around the space that had kept me alive but never really let me live. The next morning, I called. "Claire." "It's Amelia." About that room. It took 2 days to pack up everything I owned. When you live in a studio apartment for 5 years, you learn not to accumulate too much. Still, I was surprised by how neatly my life fit into 12 cardboard boxes. 12. That included my books, my dishes, the blanket Robert used to keep on the couch, and every photograph I'd refused to take off the walls. I wrapped each item carefully, not out of sentiment but out of respect. These things had carried me through quiet birthdays, forgotten holidays, and long nights of wondering if I still mattered. They had been my companions in survival. But I was done surviving. It was time to live. Claire had told me I could move in as soon as I was ready. There was no lease, no formal agreement, just trust. That felt strange at first, too easy. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that when someone offers kindness without strings, you don't need a contract. You need courage. The night before I left, I sat in my recliner one last time, sipping tea from my favorite mug. The chipped one with the faded roses. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but I didn't. Instead, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Clarity. A quiet kind of resolve. Before bed, I wrote a note and taped it to the fridge just above the coffee maker where I knew Michael would see it if he ever came. The note read, "Gone to the ocean. The people who care about me know where to find me." No explanation. No apology. That morning, I dressed in my nicest navy sweater and soft black slacks. Not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted to greet this new chapter with intention. I loaded the boxes into the back of my Civic one by one, stopping only to rest my knees between trips. The car sagged slightly under the weight, but it started up on the first try, rattling in protest as if to say, "Are you sure about this?" I was... Just as I slid into the driver's seat, I heard a knock on my window. I turned to see Mr. Rodriguez, my neighbor from 2C. He was holding a bag of tamales. "For the road," he said simply. "My wife always said don't move on an empty stomach." "Thank you," I said, taking the warm bundle. "You and Mrs. Rodriguez have been good neighbors." He nodded and gave me a long, searching look. "Your son came by last night, looking for you. Said something about needing to talk. I didn't let him in." I smiled faintly. "You did the right thing." He stepped back as I rolled down the window. "You take care of yourself, Mrs. Hayes, and don't forget to write. I promised I would, though I wasn't sure if I meant postcards or something deeper." As I pulled out of the lot, Mrs. Chen from 3A waved from her balcony. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were kind. I realized then that even in this place I'd wanted to escape, I had mattered. maybe quietly, maybe in small ways. But I'd mattered. I drove with the windows cracked, letting the salt air in as I neared the coast. Claire's house wasn't far, just 40 minutes from my old apartment, but it felt like I was crossing into another world. The streets narrowed, the trees leaned in, and then, just like that, there was the water. The ocean was different up close, wilder, unapologetic, the kind of vastness that made your problems feel smaller without belittling them. Like a friend who doesn't try to fix you, just lets you be. Claire met me at the front steps wearing her paint-streaked overalls and that ever-present ponytail. She took one look at my overstuffed car and smiled. "You pack light," she joked. "I pack honest," I replied. We carried the boxes in together. The front door creaked just slightly, and the scent of salt old wood and oil paint greeted me like an old friend I hadn't seen in decades. The room she'd offered me was modest: wood floors, a dormer window that faced the water, and a writing desk beneath it. There was no television, no shiny appliances. Just space. Space to think, to breathe. We unpacked in silence, except for the occasional question about where I wanted things. I placed the photo of Robert and me on the nightstand angled toward the window. I wanted him to see the ocean, too. By the afternoon, the boxes were empty, the shelves were full, and the kettle whistled from the kitchen. Claire made tea, poured it into mismatched mugs, and we sat on the porch overlooking the water. "You really did it," she said. "I did," I whispered. The sun dipped low, casting golden light across the waves. Boats bobbed gently in the harbor. Somewhere nearby a dog barked, and inside me the silence was different now. Not hollow, but peaceful. For the first time in years, I felt light. Like the weight of all the birthdays I spent alone, all the holidays I was forgotten, all the quiet sacrifices I made without thanks. They didn't define me anymore. They were part of my story, but not the end of it. I didn't tell Michael I had moved. I didn't tell Victoria. I didn't need to. Let them wonder. Let them sit with the silence they used to ignore me. The ocean didn't care who remembered my name. It welcomed me anyway. And as I sat there, warm mug in hand, watching the tide roll in and out, I realized that I hadn't disappeared. I'd arrived, gone to the ocean. The people who care about me know where to find me, and for once I was exactly where I wanted to be. 3 days after I moved in with Claire, I was writing a letter to Robert when I heard the sound of car doors slamming in the driveway. I'd started writing to him again. Not for anyone else, just for me. Something about being by the ocean made it easier to put my thoughts into words. It was early still. The sunlight filtered through the salt-streaked windows, casting a soft glow across the wooden floor. Claire was in her studio downstairs working on a painting of the harbor at dawn. The mood shifted instantly. I knew something was wrong the moment the engine stopped. I looked out my window and felt my heart sink. A sleek black BMW followed by another car with government plates. Michael stepped out first, looking around like he owned the place. Victoria followed, wearing a trench coat too elegant for the coast. Behind them came a woman I didn't recognize. Mid-40s, sensible shoes, carrying a briefcase. And last, of course, was Dr. Patterson, Michael's longtime physician. I called down the stairs. "Claire, we have company." Claire appeared at my door with a paintbrush still in hand. She took one look out the window and muttered, "Looks like an ambush." When she opened the front door, Michael's voice carried through the house, calm and condescending. "Good morning. I'm Michael Hayes, Brooklyn's son. I believe my mother is staying here." Claire didn't flinch. "Amelia Hayes lives here, yes. She's my housemate." "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Michael said, his voice dripping with polite concern. "My mother, she's not well. She's been making some claims that aren't based in reality. We're just here to make sure she's safe." I stayed at the top of the stairs for a moment, listening to their rehearsed concern. Claire didn't move from the doorway. "She seems perfectly lucid to me," Claire replied. "Bright, articulate, thoughtful. I enjoy her company." Michael sighed. "Ma'am, I'm sure you mean well, but you don't know the situation." The woman with the briefcase stepped forward. I'm Linda Albright with Adult Protective Services. We received a call expressing concern about an elderly woman who may be experiencing cognitive decline or financial exploitation. My blood ran cold. I knew immediately who had made the call. Claire looked up at me, her eyes steady. Amelia, would you mind coming down? There are some people here who'd like to speak with you. I took a deep breath and smoothed the front of my sweater. I had chosen it that morning because Claire once said it made my eyes look like sea glass. I walked down slowly, my hand grazing the banister, my heart beating steadily. I wouldn't show fear. Not here, not in my own home. I reached the bottom of the stairs and faced them all. Michael, Victoria, Dr. Patterson, Ms. Albright. I nodded to each of them. What brings you all here? Michael stepped forward, his face arranged into something he probably thought looked concerned. Mom, we've been trying to reach you. You just disappeared. We found your apartment empty. Your phone goes straight to voicemail. I told you, I said evenly. I moved to my house by the ocean. But this isn't your house, he said, gesturing helplessly around him. How could you afford this? I met his eyes. That's what this is really about, isn't it, Ms. Albright spoke gently. Mrs. Hayes, we received a report that you may be in a situation where someone is taking advantage of you, perhaps pressuring you to pay rent beyond your means or isolating you from your family. May I ask, I said, my voice calm, who filed that report? She hesitated. I'm not at liberty to say. It was Michael, I said, not asking. My son called because he's uncomfortable with the idea that I made a decision without his involvement. That I might have a life that exists beyond what he controls. Michael flushed. That's not fair, isn't it? I turned to Ms. Albright. You're worried about financial exploitation. I'd be happy to show you my records. I pay my rent on time. It's reasonable, below market value, in fact. Claire offered me this space because we enjoy each other's company, not because I'm being manipulated. Brooklyn. Amelia Patterson began. Perhaps we could talk somewhere private, just the two of us. It might help to do a cognitive screening. I laughed softly, not unkindly. You want to know how I can afford to live here? Let me tell you. I walked over to the fireplace mantel where I'd placed a folder the day I moved in. I handed it to Michael. These are my investment statements. After Robert died, I took what little life insurance we had, $20,000, and started investing, slowly, carefully. Over 14 years I built a portfolio, dividend stocks, index funds. I've been living beneath my means for a reason. Michael opened the folder and stared at the papers. 73,000. Not a fortune, I said, but enough to live modestly. Enough to choose peace. Enough to move to the ocean and drink tea in the morning without needing anyone's permission. Victoria peered over his shoulder, silent now. Ms. Albright took the folder, next scanning the documents. So there's no financial exploitation? She asked, frowning slightly. None, I said firmly. I am mentally competent, financially stable, and very aware of where I am and who I'm living with. Claire spoke up then, her voice cool and strong. I've lived in this town for over 3 decades. I'm well known. If I were running some kind of scheme, it wouldn't take long for word to get out. Amelia pays her share and contributes to the home. That's all. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat awkwardly. I believe there may have been some misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding, I said, locking eyes with Michael. You couldn't stand the idea that I did something bold, that I stepped outside the life you imagined for me. I was trying to protect you, he said quietly. From what I asked? From happiness, from independence, from a choice that didn't include you. He looked away. Ms. Albright closed the folder and handed it back to me. I'm sorry for the intrusion, Mrs. Hayes. It's clear you're managing your affairs just fine. We'll close the case. The group began to shuffle toward the door, their practiced concern unraveling an awkward silence. At the threshold, Michael turned back. "Mom, I'm sorry, I didn't know. I know you didn't," I said, "and that's the problem. You never asked." He nodded once, then followed the others out. I closed the door gently behind them and leaned against it, exhaling. Claire handed me my tea. That, she said, was something. I took a sip, my hands steady now. It was overdue. The ocean outside kept moving, indifferent and endless, and I knew for the first time in years I was exactly where I belonged. The silence after they left lingered like fog in the doorway. I stood there for a while, holding my teacup, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. Claire didn't say much. She simply walked back to her studio and left me to sit with it. I appreciated that. She understood silence. She understood what it meant to let someone process. I moved to the armchair by the window and sat down still in the clothes I'd chosen that morning to look capable. I hadn't expected to need armor today, but apparently, instinct still served me well. I set the folder of documents on the table beside me. Inside it were 14 years of choices, 14 years of quiet strategy, 14 years of making something out of almost nothing. The first time I invested anything, I'd been terrified. After Robert died, the payout from his life insurance came to $20,000. Not much, not when you considered funeral costs, debt, and the fact that Social Security only went so far. But something in me couldn't bear to spend all of it just to survive. I wanted that money to mean more than loss. So I read. I stayed up late poring through articles and guides, watching videos online, scribbling notes in the margins of library books. I didn't tell Michael, I didn't tell anyone. I opened an account with a firm that allowed small investments and started slowly index funds, dividend-paying stocks, nothing flashy, nothing risky, just little deposits like planting seeds in a forgotten garden. While Michael was out buying new cars and upgrading appliances, I was buying shares of companies I believed would still be around when Grace had children of her own. While Victoria was hosting themed parties for her book club, I was making soup from vegetable scraps and saving 50 cents on generic laundry detergent. People assumed I was poor. Michael assumed I couldn't afford anything more than my studio apartment. But the truth was, I chose to live that way. Not because I lacked options, but because I wanted control. That was the part no one understood. When you've spent your life being useful to everyone else, cooking their meals, ironing their clothes, keeping quiet so their voices could be heard, you learn the cost of dependence. I didn't want to be pitied. I didn't want to be taken care of. I wanted to own something that was mine. And I did. $73,000. Enough to move into a place where the waves woke me up instead of the buzz of a city bus. Enough to drink my morning tea while watching gulls dip and glide. Enough to live without having to explain myself. But more than that, it was proof that I had been capable all along. That while Michael and Victoria were too busy to call, too busy to ask how I was doing, I was quietly building a life. They never asked why I wore the same coat every winter. They never noticed that I reused gift bags or skipped lunch at family events. They assumed I was slipping, that I was confused. They mistook my silence for decline, my simplicity for desperation. I opened the folder again and looked at the latest statement. It wasn't just a number. It was resilience. It was all the times I said no to things that didn't matter so I could say yes to myself later. The doorbell rang again and my heart jumped. I opened the door to find Claire holding a tray with 2 mugs of hot cocoa and a small plate of cinnamon toast. I figured you might need a bit of sugar after all that, she said, stepping in without asking. We sat across from each other in the front room, the ocean just beyond the window, darkening as evening crept in. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke and cinnamon. I took a sip of cocoa and let it melt on my tongue. Well, she said finally, that was an impressive takedown. I laughed softly. It wasn't a takedown. It was the truth. Claire tilted her head. Same thing, really. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't need to, though. You held up the truth and let them watch it shine. I set the mug down still warm in my hands. He called Adult Protective Services on me, Claire. His own mother. Because I made a choice without him. Because you scared him, she corrected gently. You stopped being what he thought you were. Manageable, predictable. And instead you became something unknown. Powerful. That terrifies people who like control. He was humiliated, I murmured. Victoria looked like she wanted to disappear. Claire shrugged. So let them be humiliated? You didn't shame them. They did that all on their own. I didn't reply right away. I was still processing. Still trying to decide whether to feel triumphant or just tired. What do I do now? I asked more to myself than to her. Claire smiled. You keep living. You plant herbs in that window box like we talked about. You keep writing letters to Robert. You go to the harbor market on Saturdays. And when the tide comes in, you let it remind you that you made it here. On your own terms. I nodded, and for the first time I felt the truth settle in fully. I had lived quietly, carefully, even invisibly for so long. But now there was no hiding, no pretending. The numbers on that paper weren't just currency. They were freedom. They were years of holding back now released. My phone buzzed again. I didn't check it. I didn't need to. I already knew it was Michael. Apologies, probably. Confused questions. Maybe even the beginnings of justification. But I didn't feel the need to respond. I didn't owe him an explanation for becoming more than he expected. I didn't owe anyone that. I looked at Claire, who had settled into the other chair with her cocoa and one of her sketchbooks. Thank you, I said. She looked up. For what? For seeing me, I replied. For not treating me like I needed to be fixed. She didn't answer. She just nodded and went back to her drawing. Outside, the tide was rolling in. The waves whispered along the shore. And I, Amelia Hayes, sat in my own space with my own life and let the silence be full. Not empty. I had $73,000 in the bank and the courage of a woman who had lived through storms. I didn't know what the future would bring. But I knew one thing for certain. I had earned every inch of this peace, and I wasn't giving it back. It was a quiet morning, the kind I had come to love. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting soft peach and coral hues over the harbor. From the front porch, I could see the boats rocking gently in their slips, and the scent of salt air mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from my cup. I had just settled into the wicker chair when I heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. It wasn't Claire. She was in her studio, lost in a painting she'd started the night before. I looked up expecting maybe a delivery truck or a curious tourist looking for directions, but it wasn't any of those things. A small red sedan pulled in, clearly unfamiliar with the narrow curve of the drive. The engine cut off, and for a long moment nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and a young woman stepped out. She was taller than I remembered, with dark hair pulled back into a messy bun, and jeans speckled with what looked like dried paint. She stood there hesitant, scanning the house like she wasn't sure she had the right place. And then she called out, "Mrs. Hillis, I'm looking for Amelia." Hillis. I stood slowly, heart racing, the mug trembling slightly in my hand. I hadn't heard anyone say my full name like that in months. Not with uncertainty, not with hope. "That's me," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. She stepped forward, stopping at the bottom of the porch stairs. Her eyes found mine. "I'm Grace," she said. "Grace Hayes. Your granddaughter." I nearly dropped the coffee cup. She looked older now, of course. The last time I'd seen her, she was 16. Frozen in silence at that awful dinner, not speaking up, not meeting my eyes as her father humiliated me. Now she was 24 by her own admission when I asked with that careful confidence people wear after they've lived through something difficult. She climbed the steps slowly, and I stepped aside to let her pass. She walked into the house like she was entering something sacred, taking it all in. The light, the smell of the sea air, the faint sounds of gulls calling in the distance. Inside, I offered her a seat and poured her a cup of coffee. She took it, wrapping her hands around the mug like she needed something solid to hold on to. We sat in silence for a moment. Then she spoke. "Dad doesn't know I'm here," she said quietly. "He told me not to contact you, said you were going through something, that it wasn't safe to encourage your behavior." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "He called it a breakdown. Told me you'd disappeared and were living in some fantasy." She paused, looking out the window. For a while I believed him. I didn't know what to believe. But then I remembered what you said that night, about the house by the ocean, and how only people who cared about you would know where to find you. I swallowed hard. That sentence, once just a spur-of-the-moment lie born from pride, had found a second life in her memory. I realized I wanted to be one of those people she said meeting my eyes. I wanted to care enough to find you. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat was tight with something between sorrow and joy. So she went on. I saved up. 3 months of tips from waitressing, hired a private investigator, took time off from the cafe and tracked you down. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. A shot of the front of the house from the road taken from a distance, like proof that the place actually existed. When I saw it, I knew you hadn't lied. You really did it. I reached across the table and laid my hand over hers. It was shaking. So was mine. "Why didn't you say anything that night?" I asked softly. She looked ashamed. "I wanted to." But I froze. I didn't know what to say. I knew Dad was wrong, but I was scared to speak up. "You were 16. I was old enough to know cruelty when I saw it," she replied. "Old enough to say something. And I didn't. I didn't try to argue. I just sat with her in that honest space." "I've been thinking about that dinner for years," she said, "about how you just stood up and walked out like you'd finally had enough. And honestly, I admired it. I still do. I felt something shift inside me. A softening I didn't expect. I had let go of the idea that anyone from that side of the family would come looking for me. I'd made peace with the absence. But here Grace was, coffee in hand, eyes open, heart in her voice. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she said. It wasn't just the word that stopped me. It was the way she said it. With weight, with care, with truth. It had been so long since I'd heard that word. Grandma. Not Brooklyn, not Amelia. Just Grandma. It felt like a gift. "Tell me about your life," I said, my voice almost a whisper. She smiled, a little surprised. "I went to art school. Graduated last year. I paint landscapes mostly. Light and water reflections, that kind of thing. Like your great-grandmother," I said. "She used to paint the garden behind our first house. Watercolors. Nothing fancy. But she could make ordinary things feel like magic. Dad never told me that. There's a lot your father never told you." I stood and motioned for her to follow me into my room. There by the window, I'd set up a small writing desk. The surface was covered in journals, letters, and notes I'd written since arriving at the coast. "You're writing?" she asked. "I always wanted to," I said. "Robert and I used to talk about the stories we'd tell when we had time. Turns out, you make time for what matters." She opened one of the notebooks and flipped through it, her eyes scanning my words. When she looked up, her eyes were damp. "This is beautiful," she said. "You should publish this, Grandma." There it was again. Grandma, soft, steady, sincere. "Stay for lunch," I said on impulse. "Claire would love to meet you. She paints too." We spent the afternoon on the porch, the three of us. Grace, Claire, and I, talking about art, color, texture, and memory. Grace and Claire connected instantly, falling into a rhythm only artists understand. Watching them talk, seeing Grace light up as she shared her work, something settled into place in my chest. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Grace turned to me. "I want to come back," she said. "If that's okay. I want to be part of your life. What about your father?" She shrugged. "What about him? I'm an adult now. I choose who I love, And then she said the words that cracked me open in the best possible way. "And I choose you." The tide was coming in. I could hear the waves beginning to crash harder against the shore. But for the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for the storm. I was welcoming someone home. Grace moved in a month after her first visit. She didn't come with much, just a few suitcases, a portfolio of her paintings, and a heart that was finally hers to give freely. Claire cleared out the guest room without hesitation, and the two of us transformed the space into something both practical and personal. An old bookshelf became a makeshift paint rack. We set up her easel near the window so she could catch the morning light. Watching Grace settle into this house, this life stirred something deep in me. She had been lost in a world that measured love by duty, not by presence. Now she was choosing something different, and in doing so she gave me a second chance to be part of it. Mornings became a ritual. Claire brewed strong coffee. I made toast or scones depending on what we had. Grace sat at the table sketching ideas while the tide came in. The house was rarely silent anymore, but it never felt chaotic. It felt full, alive. One afternoon, while sorting through a pile of old canvases in the shed, Claire turned to us and said, "We should open a gallery. Just a small one. Nothing fancy. Something that feels like this place." Grace's eyes lit up. "We could call it Two Tides. You and me, 2 generations. Same pull." I looked between them, feeling the room tilt with possibility. "Are we really doing this?" Claire laughed. "I'm too old to wait for someday. Let's just do it." So we did. We cleaned out the shed behind the house, scrubbed the floors, hung string lights, painted the walls soft gray. Claire's paintings, stormy skies and rocky waves, lined one side of the space. Grace's bold, abstract ocean scenes took the other. I didn't intend to display anything at first. I hadn't painted in years. But Grace found a box of my old watercolors tucked in the back of my closet. "Grandma," she said, holding one up, "this is incredible." "They're just studies," I said, brushing it off. "They're honest," she replied. "They feel like the sea itself." That night, she and Claire mounted 3 of my older pieces in delicate white frames and hung them near the door. "We're doing this together," Grace said. "All 3 of us." Word spread quickly through the town. Locals were curious. They came by on weekends to browse, sip coffee, talk about art. We started selling a few pieces. Claire's first, then Grace's. One day, a woman visiting from New York bought 2 of Grace's pieces on the spot and asked if we took commissions. I was standing near the back wall organizing supplies when a man walked in, quiet and deliberate. He wore a linen blazer and tortoiseshell glasses, and he took his time moving from painting to painting. When he paused in front of one of mine, a watercolor of low tide at dusk, he leaned in, studying the brushwork, the soft gradation of color in the sky. He introduced himself as Leonard Prescott, a gallery owner from up the coast. "I curate a show on coastal artistry every fall," he said. "We feature established and emerging artists who understand the soul of the sea. Would the 3 of you be interested in participating?" We stared at him. "All 3?" Claire asked. "Especially all 3, he said. "There's something rare here, generational resonance. You can feel the story beneath the paint." The exhibition was held 2 months later in a wide, airy gallery with white walls and tall ceilings. We wore our best clothes. Grace in a linen jumpsuit, Claire in a flowing navy blouse, and I in a soft blue scarf Grace had given me for Christmas. People wandered the gallery holding wine glasses and miniature hors d'oeuvres, pausing in front of the work, nodding, murmuring. When one of my watercolors, Low Tide at Dusk, sold for $2,400, I nearly fainted. Claire caught my elbow and whispered, "Told you." By the end of the night, we had sold 9 pieces between the 3 of us. 9. More than I had ever imagined possible. I didn't say much at the reception. I was too busy watching people truly see my work, not as something made by a lonely widow, but as something that stirred emotion, memory peace. After the event, we sat in the car exhausted and glowing. Grace turned to me. "Do you realize what just happened?" I smiled. "It feels like we built something out of nothing." "No," she said. "You built something out of silence. You turned what they ignored into something they can't look away from. We used the money from the sales and my savings to put a down payment on a small cottage 10 minutes from the gallery. Real wood floors, a wraparound porch, a true ocean view. No more borrowed rooms. It was ours." Grace moved into the loft upstairs. She played music while she painted, left the windows open so the sea breeze could slip in and swirl around the room. I kept the downstairs bedroom where I wrote at a narrow desk that faced the water. Sometimes I wrote letters to Robert. Sometimes I just let the words come. Claire visited often. She still lived in her old house, but said the best part of aging was choosing your family all over again. We kept the gallery open. Two Tides became a place where locals brought their memories, where tourists paused long enough to remember what stillness felt like. People asked about the name, and I told them it started with a lie I once told over dinner, a lie that turned out to be the truest thing I'd ever said. I hadn't heard from Michael in months. After the fiasco with the social worker, he backed away, quietly. Maybe out of shame, maybe out of pride, maybe both. Victoria never reached out, and I didn't mind. The hole they left had been filled, not with bitterness, but with belonging. Grace had chosen me. Claire had welcomed me. And the ocean had held every part of me, even the pieces I thought I had buried too deep to recover. We were two tides, Grace and I. Different rhythms, same moon. And every day we opened the gallery doors, we proved that art could come from silence and love could rise from what was once broken. It was a quiet Wednesday morning when Claire walked in from the porch with a paper in her hand and a knowing smile on her face. She held it out to me wordlessly. It was a printout of a text message from our landline voicemail app. "Your son," she said simply. I took the paper and read the message. The words were curt and frantic. "We stopped by your apartment. The landlord said you moved out. Where are you?" "We're worried sick." I let the paper rest in my lap and looked out the window where the early tide was already brushing up against the rocks. The water was calm, almost gentle. It had taken months, but I had finally learned to let that rhythm match my own. Claire didn't press. She never did. She just walked to the kitchen and started the kettle, humming an old folk song under her breath. I leaned back in the chair and thought about how far away that apartment felt now. How small and dim it had become, even in memory. I imagined him standing in that space. Michael, my son. The one who hadn't visited for years, unless prompted, the one who measured my well-being by spreadsheets and silence. The apartment would have looked almost the same except for the boxes being gone. The old recliner still in the corner, the Murphy bed folded up against the wall, the tiny stove humming its usual off-key rhythm. But it would have felt empty, not just of belongings but of presence. I pictured him walking into the kitchen, probably opening cabinets like he expected to find a clue, and then seeing the note, still taped above the coffee maker where I had left it with care. "Gone to the ocean. The people who care about me know where to find me." I hadn't planned to leave it as a riddle. I just knew that if he ever showed up, I wanted something to be there. Not for guilt, not even for closure. Just to say I left on purpose. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a disappearance. This was a decision. Later that day, the neighbor downstairs, Mr. Rodriguez, sent me a message. A voice memo, slow and deliberate as always. "Your son came back. Loud. Said he needed to check on you. I told him you smart woman. You not need fixing. You just tired of being ignored." I think he heard me, but not sure he listened. I smiled, then sent a message back thanking him for always being exactly who he was. I thought about Mrs. Chen, too. She would have stood in her doorway with her arms crossed, scolding Michael in Mandarin, letting her tone say what the words didn't need to. They knew me. Not just my name, my rhythm, my heart. Even in that small, crumbling apartment building, I had managed to create a quiet sort of community, one built not on obligation but on presence. That was something Michael had never understood. He saw relationships as ledgers to balance, support given support expected. He called when it was convenient, stopped by when it was performative. But love is not a check-in. Love is consistency. I didn't answer his messages, not right away. The first few came like a flood. Texts, missed calls, voicemails. Then they slowed. A few days passed with nothing. Then another one, this time a little softer. "Please, just let me know you're okay." Claire sat beside me one evening after we'd closed the shop. We were drinking peppermint tea, the kind she always made when the air turned sharp. "Are you going to tell him where you are? I thought about it for a long time." "I already did." She raised an eyebrow. "The note I said, looking out toward the sea. It said everything I needed to say." Claire didn't argue. She just nodded and looked at the sky. The clouds were pink and blue cotton soft. The sun dipped low, kissing the horizon like it knew how fleeting beauty was. Grace came out from the loft above the shop carrying one of her new canvases. She held it up, unsure. "I don't know if it's finished," she said. I stood and walked over. The painting was of a shoreline. Not literal, but emotional. The brushstrokes were rough in places, smooth in others. There was a tension in the middle, a ridge of color that split the canvas but didn't divide it. "It's beautiful," I said. "It feels honest." Grace smiled. "It's called receding." I looked at her and nodded. "Yes, that's exactly what it feels like." That night I sat on the porch long after the others had gone inside. The waves were louder now, the tide crashing harder as it pulled away from the shore. I let the sound fill me. I thought about all the times I had kept my voice small to make room for others. How many meals I had cooked without being invited to sit. How many holidays I had watched from the sidelines while Michael and Victoria smiled for photographs I was never asked to be in. And now he was the one on the outside. I didn't feel revenge. I didn't feel triumph. I felt stillness. I pulled out my phone and opened a new message. I kept it short. "I'm at my house by the ocean. The people who care about me know where to find me." I hit send. Then I turned the phone off, not because I didn't want to hear his reply, but because I didn't need it. The wind picked up. The stars blinked to life overhead. And I, a woman once dismissed as invisible, sat in the center of my own story, surrounded by brushstrokes, salt air, and the deep, steady sound of the tide. I had left a note by the coffee maker. But the real message, the one I carried in every breath, was this: I am not gone. I am free. 6 months after I sent that final message to Michael, the story made its way through the town like sea mist. Soft, lingering, and impossible to ignore. Not the story he tried to spin about a confused elderly woman living in fantasy, but the real story. The one where a mother quietly left the table she was no longer welcomed at and built something entirely her own. In small towns, things travel fast. People started whispering about the son who called Adult Protective Services on his own mother because she dared to move. The gallery owner who bought my first painting brought it up during a fundraiser, not as gossip, but as a reminder of how we treat the ones who raised us. Michael's name became a cautionary tale in conversations among neighbors and shopkeepers, not with malice, just disappointment. Dr. Patterson quietly updated his records, noting my mental fitness and independence. He didn't reach out again. Neither did Victoria. And Michael, once so loud in his concern, fell silent. Grace remained. She grew into herself more each day, her paintings bolder, more daring yet grounded in emotion. She had found her voice not just on canvas, but in the way she spoke, moved, lived. She still worked part-time at a local cafe, but her real hours were spent in the studio surrounded by light and salt air. Together we saved. Between the gallery sales, my investment income, and the commissions Grace had begun to receive, we did something I once only dared to dream of. We bought a cottage. Not a rental, not a shared space. ours. It sat on a bluff 10 minutes from the gallery, a pale blue house with white trim and a porch that wrapped around like a hug. The view was everything I had once imagined: waves crashing below seabirds wheeling above, and a sky that stretched farther than my regrets ever could. Grace took the attic loft and filled it with canvases and skylights. I claimed the ground floor bedroom with the bay window, perfect for writing. We turned the guest room into a shared studio where we painted side by side the smell of turpentine and sea air always mingling. I started writing more than letters. With Grace's encouragement, I began drafting a memoir, not to sell, not for approval, but because there were things inside me that needed to come out, stories of sacrifice, love, silence, and eventually awakening. The working title was The Lie That Became True. Though Grace insisted we'd come up with something better, I also painted again, at first just for myself, small seascapes and memories in color. But then Claire came by one day, looked at a painting of a foggy shoreline and said, "This belongs in the front window." I laughed but handed it over. It sold within a week. We kept the Two Tides Gallery open. Tourists came and went, but locals began to linger. They brought friends, asked questions. The space became more than a gallery. It became a conversation. Between generations, between grief and healing, between what had been lost and what could still be found. Sometimes people would ask if we had any family in town. I'd smile and say, "Just the ones who chose to stay." Michael never did come back. I heard from a neighbor that he'd taken a promotion in another state. Victoria had gone with him. Grace kept in touch with her younger cousins on occasion, but not often. That part of her life had grown quieter, and she no longer needed to pretend she didn't notice the difference. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip into the water, Grace turned to me and asked, "Do you ever regret it?" Walking away, I thought about it for a long moment. No, but I grieved it. "There's a difference," she nodded, understanding more than her years should have allowed. "I think you taught me that." I smiled. "I didn't mean to teach you anything. I just stopped apologizing for being real, and that I realized was what had changed everything. When I stopped shrinking myself to fit into the version of me that others found convenient, I made room for the version of me that felt true. I stopped chasing invitations that never came. I stopped waiting for apologies that were never spoken. I stopped mistaking silence for peace. I chose. Not out of spite, not to prove a point. I chose to live. The ocean became my measure of time. The tides rolled in and out like breath, like memory, like forgiveness. Every morning I stood at the kitchen window with my cup of tea and watched the light hit the water. Some days it glimmered like glass. Other days it roared, but always it moved. One morning, after a long stretch of stillness, I wrote the final line of my memoir. I read it aloud to myself, then to Grace, then later to Claire. "The waves still crash," I wrote, "but now I let them carry me, not drown me." Grace teared up a little when I read it to her. "It sounds like a goodbye," she said. "No," I told her gently. "It's a beginning." Because that's what it felt like. A life that began not in youth or marriage or motherhood, but in the quiet courage to step away, to walk toward something without a map, to believe that even at 68 a new life wasn't a fantasy, it was a possibility. Sometimes customers asked what inspired the name of our gallery. I'd tell them it started with a lie I told over salmon and silence during a dinner I wasn't meant to enjoy. A lie about a house by the ocean. But what I wouldn't always say, what I saved for those who truly listened, was that the lie had become a lighthouse, and I had followed it home. Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people you love? Have you ever swallowed your worth just to keep the peace? If Amelia's story resonated with you, if you've ever longed to be seen, not just helped, then you're not alone. Sometimes walking away isn't giving up. It's choosing yourself quietly and completely. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts or your own journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next powerful story we share. Because every woman has a story worth hearing. Maybe yours is next.